You know, one of the things I really appreciated what the chairman said. How much, General Dodaro, how much, can you give me a sense of your work at the GAO? How much are we measuring any kind of metrics or effectiveness within government that you have seen of programs? My sense is very little.
That's correct. And one thing really surprised me is we've done this overlap and duplication work despite the original Government Performance Act that was passed in 1993, which required goals and measures. When we looked across these specific program activities, we found in many areas that there really hasn't been good measures of performance, or more importantly, effectiveness reviews, program evaluations of what's working and what's not. And that really is a limiting factor in helping Congress quickly address some of these issues. And, you know, I think it's what we find, the burden of proof is on us. If we want to have a program stop, you have to convince people to stop a program. You don't have to say, okay, to the programs, what are you doing to justify additional expenditure? So the incentives are exactly the opposite.
So we have to put that in reverse if we're going to actually be able to demonstrate to taxpayers that if we put resources in a particular area, that we're getting the results that we're purporting to, you know, to want, whatever the area is, whether it's STEM, drug prevention. You know, one of the things I see is that members of Congress propose new programs, and then they don't even look to see whether there is a program already addressing the area. How much do you view that as a factor with where we have come in the duplication here? Or do you see that also happening in the executive branches, of both branches being guilty of this?
I think it happens in both branches. What happens there are three different factors that I've seen sort of overall. One is there's an accretion over time. Surface transportation is one. We started out with the interagency or interstate highway system in the 50s. We added over decades to come up with 100 programs, so it happens over time. Secondly, you'll have a broad program to, say, provide training to somebody who's unemployed, and somebody will say, well, we're not getting to the veterans, we're not getting to Native Americans, we're not getting to the youth. So we need programs targeted in those areas as opposed to figuring out how to make the basic program work more effectively for those targets. And then thirdly, and defense is a whole sort of set of circumstances. There you have service-centric incentives, and you have stovepipes, and defense is replete with overlap and duplication.
How much could we, in terms of legislation, I mean, I almost like the idea that no one can propose a new program unless they justify that there isn't another program that does what they're proposing to do. What thoughts do you have on legislation that would try to stop this proliferation of programs when we haven't evaluated what we already have?
I think that that's an important area. I know Senator Coburn has introduced some legislation to that effect, and others have as well. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is that there needs to be, the paradigm needs to shift on programs that are already in existence of demonstrating their effectiveness in order to get additional funding in the future and to maintain their existence.
The burden of proof has to shift, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Should be on the program to justify to us versus, you know, the reverse, which is happening now.
That's exactly right, and I think that's one of the reasons you both quoted President Reagan, and that's one of the fundamental reasons that's true.
Mm-hmm. When I look at some of the areas serving, you were talking about the stovepiping within the Pentagon, since I also serve on armed services. I see that each branch has its own administrative functions, many of them duplicative. How would you recommend us going forward to try to eliminate that? Because I think there's been a lot of attempts to do it. What would you do if you were in my shoes, for example?
Well, we've pointed out very specific areas, and I'd start there. First, every service has its own military command. And Congress has now required them to come forward with a proposal. We're evaluating it. They've taken some incremental steps, but probably not fully achieved everything that's possible there. There have been estimates that we updated, you could save $200 to $400 million there. Unmanned aircraft systems. You know, the Navy wanted to have its own Global Hawk instead of using the Air Force's Global Hawk. And there's a lot of payload systems, you know, operating systems for these things that everybody's designing their own. Electronic warfare, same thing. Information surveillance, reconnaissance information. I mentioned the combat uniform. So we have a lot of very specific areas. And the other area is strategic sourcing. They're not leveraging their purchasing power very well in this area as well. We've estimates in the private sector. We just issued a report yesterday saying the private sector gains from 4 to 15% annually by leveraging its purchasing power, and DOD does not do that. Neither do other large civilian agencies. So I don't mean to single them out. That's a problem across government. So I'd say focus on the specific areas that we've given and try to hold them accountable. And there has to be department-wide efforts and focus on this, but the Congress has to be an integral part of that process.
My time has expired, and obviously there's so much to all of this, but I appreciate you both being here.
Before I go to Senator Johnson, I just want to mention, I think, building on what you said, that, you know, one of the things, you know, GAO does a great job of helping to identify some of these flaws. You know, OMB, you can argue, you know, depending on their priority, does some of this as well. Until the GIPRA bill, there was no effort ever at the actual agency level to ask those folks who are running to identify not just their good programs, but their underperforming programs. And it was enormous pushback from this administration. I think it'd be from any administration. But we've got that first list. Amy, it came back a couple of months ago, right? So it would be, I think, a good guidepost to add to this information.
No, that sounds terrific, and I agree with that. And also, I think going forward, creating incentives within the agencies for the people that work there, greater incentives for them to come forward as performance measures.
Amen.
Yeah.